So I'm going to now bring back on AnnaLee Saxenian. I've already spoken praises of Dean Saxenian, and really pleased to have her here. And we're going to have a book talk. We're just going to have a dialogue about the work she's been doing, both the books, the 2 books she's written, as well as some of the new stuff she's been working on, which we'd love to learn more about. What inspired you to write these books in the first place? I mean, they were different for their time, and how were they received?
Wow. So what inspired them and how were they received? Yeah. Are 2 different questions, but I'll start with what inspired them. Well, actually, so go back to 1970s, the late 1970s. I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, and I needed a master's thesis topic. And after trying to do something very global and being told by my advisor that it was too big, I decided that I would study San Jose. San Jose was the fastest growing city in the country at the time. It was barely known as Silicon Valley at that time. And I started to write about this place. And I actually wrote a master's thesis in which I confidently predicted that Silicon Valley would stop growing. This is 1980. I argued that the transportation was too congested, housing was too expensive, the price of labor was too high, and innovation and growth would all happen outside of the Bay Area.
So you were wrong before you were right.
I was very wrong. I was very wrong, and then that forced me to reconsider. And essentially, I mean, in a very short sentence, what I realized was that this was not a place that operated by the standard economic models that we used. It was not based on cost. The costs were very high, but people kept coming here. Firms kept moving here because the value being generated by being in this place was so much higher than whatever the costs were. And I really spent the next several years trying to untangle what it was that made Silicon Valley tick. And that ultimately led to my first book, which compared Silicon Valley with the Boston area. And that came out in 1994. And I got a letter, it was very well received. I think I was very lucky in my timing. Right place,
People
right
were
time.
looking for this book.
Yeah. But I got a letter from a venture capitalist, and he said, your book is fantastic. You've got the Valley right except for one thing. And the minute I read it, I knew he was right. He said, the immigrants. And he was exactly right. This was like now 95. And I had seen throughout my research consisted largely of going and interviewing people. And I had met more and more, immigrants from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from Israel. And I realized that that was an important piece of the story that I had missed. And I started with a very small project, hoping to just count them, figure out how many they were. And I actually had a question. The question that motivated that early research was, do the immigrants become part of the networks, which were kind of white men, was old boys networks that were kind of white men, or did they exist outside? How did they negotiate being part of Silicon Valley, which was at that time a pretty closed network? And as I started to interview and track down these immigrants, first of all, I realized there were far more than I had ever anticipated and that anybody really knew. And secondly, that they were not simply contributing to Silicon Valley in certain ways, but also they were building bridges back to their home countries. And that was the most important dynamic that I was seeing, that Silicon Valley model, at least parts of the Silicon Valley model, were being exported by these immigrants, who I then called Argonauts, back to their home countries. So that's what's triggered the second book.
And the methodology of your book, it's qualitative, not quantitative.
Totally.
Right? And that decision has all sorts of implications for research. Tell us about that decision, qualitative versus quantitative.
Well, in the academy, the gold standard is to have quantitative data as well as, you can complement it with qualitative, but people want hard facts. One of the biggest challenges, and this remains a challenge today, is that we don't collect data in the right aggregations. So we collect data about the state of California or about the city of San Jose, but the region of Silicon Valley, which by the way keeps changing, was not a unit of analysis. So it was very hard for me to get data about Silicon Valley. It was impossible to get data on the number of companies that were being started. It was impossible to get data on the number of immigrants. All of the things that I was trying to study were not things that were considered of importance in the frameworks that, these data collection frameworks that we have in the US now for understanding the economy. Those were created in the post-war period. And they were created around business cycles, and national economies. So we have a lot of great data on the national economies, and we have a lot of great data on prices and business, fluctuations in employment. So you can see the Keynesian model very much in all of our data. But this new phenomenon is about regions, and it's about people starting things, and it just flew way below the radar. So I didn't have much of an alternative but to use qualitative data.
I mean, it seems like we're sort of prisoners to the data, right? Because the data was, the things we measure in systems is a function of the worldview that they came out of.
Precisely.
And if you had to think about what would those new measurements, what could they possibly be if you have a new worldview? What would those, I mean, just take a stab. I mean, this is a tough question.
Well, no, I mean, I certainly think we need to measure the way new things are started, all these new entrepreneurial ventures, whether they're profit-making or non-profit. There's just a tremendous amount of activity that's not tracked. I did a studio when I was teaching in the planning department in the early 90s, and we did a studio on the software industry in Alameda County. This is ancient history now, but we realized that the public data just on software startups was sorely inadequate, because until you become big enough to be tracked by the major data collectors, you just fly under the radar. And I'm sure that, so first of all, you would have to find a mechanism for measuring all of this decentralized activity. It's a much bigger challenge than, I used to think, well, if I could study Detroit, there are 3 big companies, and I know what goes on inside of those companies. But thousands of companies are started every year here. So somehow tracking those and their specializations and their recombinations. I mean, the essence of this place is about experimentation and new ideas and recombinations and new ventures, and it's a very difficult thing to measure, but if we could get our hands around just that kind of activity, obviously data on funding would be important and helpful. We have data on patents, which is kind of interesting and useful. I would love data that track global flows of people and of economic activity. What else? I mean, I'm sure that we could go down the list and come up with many other things. Yeah.
But it's along these lines, which is, right now it's basically invisible to measurement because the world just hasn't thought of this as value, right?
Right.
This is one of the things you write about a lot is the traditional economic models and how this is a challenge. You talk about how traditional economics had a core and a periphery. How the Silicon Valley is the core and everyone else is on the periphery, and the best they can hope is to get some of the runoff from the core.
Right.
But this is really changing. And have you been able to see any impact or shift in the model itself, or as people gather around these new ideas?
Well, yeah, I think that people have been, I think the reality has changed too. So it's not just my ideas, but also the reality has become overwhelmingly powerful, so people can't deny it. I mean, to give you one anecdote, when I wrote Regional Advantage, I guess it was there were a lot of people on the East Coast who were very skeptical. And I was a little critical.
They sometimes still are.
Yeah, right, exactly, they are. And I was told, well, that stuff in Silicon Valley, it's just the froth on the top of the waves. Really, in the end, this is all going to become dominated by, big firms and keiretsu, and this is just, it's a temporary phenomenon. And every time there's a business cycle downturn, people say Silicon Valley is dead. I mean, they said it when the Japanese outcompeted us in the memory chip industry. I mean, every decade there's a prediction that it's dead.
It's dead every decade.
Yeah, it is. And the truth is that it's the most resilient economy we have in the world. I mean, it's just, you can take out whole companies, whole industries, and the place still regenerates. And that's because of this ecosystem that you describe. But what was the question?
Well, just the impact that the model.
The model. So the core periphery one is an interesting one because I was writing about the Argonauts, and the idea, historically was that the U.S. was the core, and the rest of the world was the periphery, and there was no chance to catch up. And the brain drain, the notion of the brain drain, that people come here, it's a loss for the sending country, and it's a gain for the winning country, and it will just exacerbate inequality. Well, part of the story of the Argonauts, of people circulating and going back home to their home countries, is about people taking their knowledge and their insights and their contacts and connections back home and starting this. And really overturns that core-periphery dichotomy. And we've seen now with the rise of India, with China, all the emerging economies. So the reality is changing quickly, as well as my ideas are helping. But I would say that the reason that ideas are being changed is because the world is just, demonstrating over and over again that the power of people and these communities that get developed and then start, the communities that I traced that went home to Israel or to Taiwan or to China or India, they took with them an understanding of the Silicon Valley model. I mean, I like to say that they marinated in it. They came, they lived here for 5-10 years, and they took home with them, a set of the cultural attributes that you guys have been describing here this evening. They were much more flexible, they were much more open to taking risks, they were willing to try new things, they were willing to invest more openly. So while I would never say that there's another Silicon Valley in China or in India today, there are hybrids there. There are hybrids that mix what existed there previously with what these people have brought back. So I think, the world is the core periphery model is probably, if it's being taught still, it shouldn't be.
and in your work, you could see, the influence of immigrants and the ability of, the importance of movement and idea movement. And you yourself, you're Armenian,
Yes.
of Armenian heritage.
Yeah.
How much of that background allowed you to see this stuff that perhaps other observers didn't see?
Wow, that's a good question. I think I was very attuned. So all 4 of my grandparents came to the US around 1915. So I'm actually a 3rd generation, so I'm not, that close to it. I was the generation that didn't want to learn the Armenian language and didn't like going to the churches because they were kind of there was too much incense and fancy dress. But I think knowing my grandparents' story, their voyage around the world, knowing how much I got from them and from what they brought and gave to my parents, I understood that these long journeys are possible and that there's nothing, well, there are legal institutions and policies, but that in fact, this is about people movement, and people can move and bring their ideas with them wherever they go. So.
But did it give you a sense of the culture of Boston versus Silicon Valley? Could you see the role of hierarchy and rigid social structures versus flexible social structures?
Absolutely. So that's the dirty secret is that I grew up in the suburbs of Boston, and my uncle worked at Digital Equipment Corporation, and a lot of my neighbors worked at MIT, and so I understood intuitively what the Boston ecosystem looked like, the hierarchies, the secrecy, the autarky, the I like to say that the founding myth of the Boston Route 128 area was the lawsuit, because Digital Equipment Corporation, which is a big mini computer company, Data General spun out of it, and the first reaction was a lawsuit. So whereas in Silicon Valley, when companies, there's this whole story about genealogies, people spin out of other companies and they like to look at each other as familial. These are familiar relationships, whereas in the Boston area, it was always lawsuits. So I think I grew up in one culture. When I came here and started to study what was then San Jose, my eyes just kind of went, this is so different. It's the exact same industry. If anything, you would expect that the Boston area would outcompete the Silicon Valley area because it was older, there was a lot more capital there were a lot more technical, people, engineers, human capital was much greater. They were close to Washington, D.C., where all the military contracts were. So one thing after another would line up, and yet this kind of funky place out on the West Coast that now gets a lot of attention, but at the time was really seen as marginal, as peripheral, really has, overtaken the old core.
In Regional Advantage, you tell some really good stories through your interviews of what would happen if someone left the company. Like if an individual left to try something new, what was that like for them?
Well, so, as opposed to Boston where I interviewed people all over and I said, why don't you leave and start your own company? Because I had seen so many people doing it here, and they just said, oh, I couldn't, I'd lose my pension. But people in Silicon Valley became part of an extended network. So, the joke was you could change jobs without changing carpools. It's probably not true anymore. But somebody who leaves becomes a lifetime piece of your network, and part of that community that you can draw upon at any time in the future when you have a problem, when you need to find a new, somebody who can do marketing, or somebody who knows chip design, or somebody who knows this kind of algorithm. That kind of sort of comprehensive understanding of the skill base is a huge asset. The openness with which people flowed between companies here was kind of almost heretical in what the American economy looked like previously.
And I think you also wrote about the social ostracism, right? These families, if they left digital equipment, they were cast out of the social system entirely.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. You were a traitor, complete traitor.
So, I mean, you've probably thought about the origins of this and why culture evolved this way in the Valley, and you write a lot about the sense of identity, and
yeah.
I'm curious your thoughts on that and how it happened. And
yeah. No, it's a really good question. So I think my best guess is, first of all, those of you that don't know, this place was really just a center of agriculture up until about 1940. There was some antecedent technological activity going on here, but it was the largest exporter of prunes and apricots in the world. And I think it started to change with World War II, with both, there was the Pacific, there was activity in the Pacific, so that brought military people to the Bay Area, but also the funding, the Cold War funding of military, and then microwaves and all sorts of technical semiconductors later on were very, very important. But the people who came here in the 70s, 60s and 70s, they felt like they were outsiders. They felt like outsiders. The center of power and sort of economic and political power in the US was on the East Coast. This was kind of nowhere. I mean, it's hard to believe that now. You fly into, the Bay Area and everybody knows about it. But at the time, and this was really only 4 decades ago, this was kind of a hick town, San Jose. And there really wasn't much going on. And even LA was just, LA was starting to take off as an industrial power, but the Bay Area was not. And so the engineers that came here, they were isolated, they felt like outsiders, and one of the things they did was they hung together. They sort of worked together in the way that engineers might work in a lab. They didn't know any better. They didn't know what a company should look like. So, in some sense, their distance from Boston, New England, even the Midwest was an asset because they organized production the way that made sense to them. They shared a lot more information about what they were doing with their production and their technology than people would have in an East Coast company. They were very turned off by the hierarchies of the companies that they interacted with on the East Coast, with the chauffeurs and the exclusive cafeterias and fancy corner offices. And so they created a much more egalitarian culture within the firms, so that both within and between firms you had a much more open network. And they didn't do that intentionally, really, but it started to work. And it especially started to work in the 80s when Japan sort of outcompeted us in chips, and there was a new wave of startups. And there's something about the way that these continuing waves of startups worked that actually reinforced this decentralized open network system that was evolving here. So I think it worked so well that people realized that maybe it was worth keeping, and there was less attempt to try to create what the right model was.
I want to open it up for questions from the audience. But as you think about your question or raise your hand for a question, I'll kind of give you one more question, which is you've been taking a lot of your learning and you've been applying it in Berkeley, in the classes you've been designing, and be interested in you sharing perhaps how you're trying to teach the next generation and how you're applying these ideas.
That's great question. Well, so I'm a professor, but I've also become dean of a school. It's called the School of Information. It's a new school. Most people have never heard of a school of information, so I sometimes joke and say, oh, we're the Ministry of Information. But it's a school that was created with we used to be the School of Library and Information Science, and the internet came along and people realized that information wasn't just going to be organized in books anymore. Information was everywhere. Information was being organized on the internet in digital forms, in audio and visual forms, and that you needed a set of technical as well as design skills as well as management skills. So it was created as an explicitly multidisciplinary program. And when I took over, I just, I took over. I had never thought I wanted to be a dean. Like administration, no. But I realized that this was a place that could educate people in the way that I thought we needed in places like Silicon Valley, which was people come in from many different disciplines. We have people who come in from philosophy and linguistics, as well as computer science and engineering and political science. And we force them all to learn certain things in common. They all need to learn some programming and some technical knowledge about networks and how networks are designed. They also have to learn about the social context and the user. How does a customer work? How do you design a product for a user? User-centered design, user experience design is very important. They also need to know about policy and about some of the issues about privacy, intellectual property rights, a lot of the issues that are sort of around us with information products. And then a lot of our courses are really about working in teams and doing projects in teams. And really, it's all about trying new things, starting new things. They're required to do final projects where they work in a team and produce something. You know, some of them go off and start businesses on them. But it's a radical departure, I think, from what the education that I got, certainly, in graduate school.
So you're like training a generation of ecosystem warriors.
There
basically.
you go. I like it.
Questions? Yeah, right there. Oh, microphone. There you go.
Oh my goodness, it's Chris.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Chris.
Chris Meyer. You described a kind of Achilles heel of the Boston ecosystem in terms of conservatism and risk aversion and zero-sum attitude.
Yeah.
So what is today's Silicon Valley's Achilles heel?
I think the biggest Achilles heel, not in this room obviously, but I think is the inability to understand the public good and the need to invest in the public good. Most of the people here still believe that they did it on their own, that they are individual entrepreneurs and that, that they could have succeeded no matter what, And the fact is that all of the collective investment that sort of has sustained this valley, so the military investments over the post-war period, the school system, I mean, California, in 1960 had the leading public education system in the world. Clark Kerr created these 3 tiers with higher education and the state colleges and the community colleges. Really a remarkable invention. And the freeways, there was tremendous investment in the 60s. So there was the public good is very important to the way that private gains are realized in Silicon Valley. And yet people have not recognized it, and we see that now. We're not reinvesting in our education system, we're not reinvesting in our infrastructure. I would say that, you've seen some of the explosive conflicts in San Francisco over recent months between, as Silicon Valley has even, Silicon Valley historically never had anything to do with San Francisco, but now a lot of young engineers and entrepreneurs are living in San Francisco, hipsters, I guess I should call them, and there's a lot of resentment as they're driving the prices of housing up. And, the inequality in this valley has gotten very severe. It's gotten a lot worse than it was. We have CEOs who are taking away millions and millions of dollars, and, people who cannot afford, school teachers who can't afford to live here. So that is one sort of pressing importance, that is the sort of signal importance to this valley. And if we can't come together and address that, I'm going to be a lot more pessimistic.
Ade.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your book. It really was very instrumental in some of my work. In most regions, strangers coming together is quite a tough thing. And when you talk about immigrants, that's one of the things I'm trying to work out, because even within countries, different tribes or different ethnic groups don't get along. My question may be a bit controversial, but I was curious if the psychedelic drug culture in the Silicon Valley with the hippies helped in some of this social fabric modulation. I mean, there's something that the drugs makes people a bit chill.
Yeah, it's a great question.
What's failure,
I love it. I love it. I think the 60s had an enormous influence on the Valley. I mean, all of these ideas about openness and, Steve Jobs, he was in this hacker club that, built PCs, and it was very open exchange. So a lot of the cultural values that came from the whole Earth catalog, but not from, I don't know if it was the psychedelic drugs exactly, but the West Coast has always sort of attracted people who are different in many, many different ways. I will say that, if you talk to the early immigrants in the Valley, the early Chinese, Indian, whatever, it wasn't always easy. So the initial reaction was glass ceilings and whatnot. But over time, it's amazing how meritocratic it is and how people become assimilated, how easily people become assimilated. I was shocked when I started doing research here. I would go and interview people. They would just sit and talk to me for hours. They would give me their Rolodexes. They would open up their Rolodexes. And then I would go and do research in Boston or in the UK or something. And, I would have a hard time getting in the door, And so somehow there's something about the way that this culture reproduces itself. And I think that actually the organizers of this conference understand that. If you start to give and share and be generous, it will be reciprocated. And so I think that has been a very powerful mechanism in the Valley.
Yep. Another question. Yeah, right there.
Oh, hi, I'm Jen Myronic, and I'm leading a new initiative with the Content Magazine's Media Lab. I'm a native of San Jose, and my question is identity. What's happened is that we've moved from having the Fourth Estate document great stories. The Mercury News used to be 2 editions a day, in Vietnamese and in Spanish in the evenings. What happens when we don't report on the full ecosystem? And I know we're going to be working on documenting these stories where all we hear are PR spins and the latest tech gadgets. Have we lost our identity to document people that are not extroverts, the introverts, the people that are all sorts of styles of being part? One thing I'm curious about is how does that impact our data and urban planning when we're not hearing from the full community and there's no public record being created?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. I'm so glad you raised it, because I think, look, the decline of the media, the traditional media has left a gaping hole. And, it's part of this public good that we used to take for granted. And it's not there anymore, and we need people. We need young people like you who are, everybody in this room should be sort of fighting for these things. I think it's really essential that we represent the entire community and don't just represent the people who succeed and don't just represent, one piece of the community. And that's really, it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge. There's so much success in this valley, and it's good to celebrate it, but you need to also understand that success is not the only story, and that there are other stories that need to be told. And yeah, I get sick of the press releases myself as well.
There's a big difference in perspective when you look at it at an individual level versus a system level. And like Eugene Kleiner has been in the news a lot recently, and he thinks he did it himself.
Right.
And I think there's sort of it's very easy for them to confuse their own efforts with the benefit that they got from the system, right?
Totally. No, I think that's right.
Yeah. Why don't we go over there? Tom. Oh, you have a microphone already. You first.
Sorry. Leon Galindo from Bolivia. Jorge Lopez is a fellow from my hometown that spent about 15 years at Adobe Systems, moved back to Bolivia, and he's grown in less than a decade. He's grown a company from 4 to 400 software employees, so he very much speaks to the story you were telling about. The question is, what happens with those of us who don't necessarily want to move to the United States? We live in South America, Asia, and Africa. We appreciate the benefits of the US system, but we don't see ourselves necessarily as emigrating here. How is the system evolving to accommodate to those who want to work within this incubation ecosystem without necessarily having to make a dramatic life move? How do you see that playing out?
It's a really important question. So I do think that in the first couple of decades, Silicon Valley was sort of this singular place, and you had to come here. But now it really is a node in a network. And there are other nodes. There are nodes in Tel Aviv or Haifa. There are nodes in Beijing or Shanghai and Bangalore. And I think Bolivia needs a node. I think that's the story of this conference, too. And I think it's a realistic goal. I believe that the technology now allows people to have all the information they need and the connectedness they need, but not be living here. I think that, people probably need to travel more than they did if they want to stay completely connected to this particular ecosystem. But, as this network becomes more elaborate, I hope there are nodes, linking, Bolivia with Brazil and Bolivia with Argentina, and that you see these networks replicate at sort of, different levels. It doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't all be centered in one hub, okay, in one Silicon Valley. So good luck. Yeah.
Tom.
Great, thank you, Victor. One of my observations in interacting with Victor and his colleagues is about, I guess, the nature of competition. And that what I find out here is that competition is something a little more intrinsic, that is competition with oneself to maximize potential, whereas in other places that are chasing innovation, competition is oftentimes expressed in terms of beating the other team, the other state, the other nation, whatever the case may be. And I'm wondering if you have a comment on the nature of competition and innovation.
Well, I guess I have two comments. I mean, I think we can whip ourselves into a competitive furor about beating, they're competing with us, so I don't think we're pure on that sense. But I certainly think that one of the values of this ecosystem is that it allows people to make the best of themselves. There are opportunities, if you can take advantage of them, that probably don't exist elsewhere. So you're competing against yourself, meaning you are doing the best you possibly can. The other thing about competition here that is often not noticed is that the firms that succeed are not firms that compete head-on with one another. They define new niches. So the reason you can have 25 disk drive startups or 25 data startups now, and the whole system doesn't just collapse with inefficiency, is because they're all trying different technical pathways. So that as you find a new niche, a new trajectory within the existing system, you're not competing head on. It's not like, and that makes a huge difference because some of you do fail. You can't survive forever with 25 companies in the same exact sort of area, but the ones that fail you learn a lot from. And so there's a sense in which competition is not about cutting costs and trying to destroy one another. It's about mutual learning. It's about, I'll try this pathway. Think about, if you thought about Silicon Valley as one big giant company, you wouldn't be able to try all these experiments. You couldn't have 15 analytics companies all starting within the company. No manager would allow that. You would have to make some hard choices. But because it's decentralized and it's not under the same roof, lots of people tried different algorithms, different styles of analysis. And I think that's a source of tremendous strength that, rather than competing, and I think we see, sometimes when competition from elsewhere, like with China or Japan, has been head-on. And that can be very threatening, but when we see a lot of these other nodes, they've adapted this too. So the firms that are in Israel now are producing products that are complementary to the systems developed here. They're doing security, they're doing intellectual property. So essentially they become part of a big value chain rather than trying to knock out another region or another company.
You've got a great story in the Regional Advantage where you say, where when startup companies ran out of components, they'd go to their neighbor, which was a competitor startup company in the same sector,
exactly,
to borrow components
yeah.
to do their work.
And that's very rare elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very rare.
Yep.
Hi. Is it on?
Yep.
Yay. Hi, I'm Kathy Swain. And I actually lived on Santo Road, and at Oak Creek Apartments and worked on Santo Road in 1972 through 74.
Oh, so you lived it.
And I worked for a management consulting firm, and we were doing primary and secondary market research and writing investment memorandum business plans for startups in Silicon Valley. And so it was a very interesting time and an interesting experience.
Amazing, yeah.
But I just would offer that some would argue that the greatest Achilles heel is when you don't think you have one. And,
being blind to your own.
Yeah, I've certainly had that thought. But my real question was around the, and I'll make no public comment about the hallucinogenics, by the way. But the question was around the degree program. I hate to bring you back to that, but I've been passionate about multidisciplinary studies for a long time, let's put it that way, since I was in grad school. And I'm just curious, what do you call this degree? How do you attract students?
Oh, yeah.
What are their expectations when they graduate? How is the degree viewed? You know, I mean,
Great questions.
this
Well,
is
So I'm going to start first with
fabulous.
your history. So the fact that in the 70s you were doing market research, you were sort of an independent consulting firm for firms, that's sort of a sign of the early division of labor. It wasn't all being done within the firms. You sort of service providers were emerging even then, specialized. Yeah, you were special. So, yeah. Right. So, I mean, the point is that a lot of startups started in the same generation. You know, Silicon Valley Bank was a startup around that time, too. And they bootstrap one another up. So this model I've used with my new school. We have a Master of Information Management and Systems and then a PhD. And we just launched an online degree, a Master of Information in Data Science. The students do brilliantly. We're a very small program. Students all get great jobs. They're doing fantastic things. I mean, you know, they should be, what? Oh, user experience designer at, you know, Facebook, or a consultant at IDEO, or they go and work for the public sector, or they work, there's several of our master's students are privacy experts who go around consulting on privacy issues. So we produce about between 50 and 60 master's students a year, and a small number of PhDs. I would love to be able to do more. This is actually an interesting story. I think we're resented within the academy. I don't know who's here from Berkeley. I think we're threatening. I mean, we're not a traditional discipline. We're threatening to computer science, we're threatening to the business school, we're threatening to all the single discipline units. Our students, they meet our students and they think, wow, these guys are doing amazing things. But one of the challenges we have now on the Berkeley campus, is a public university. We've been really ravaged by budget cuts, and there's a real sense of a zero-sum game. It's not a good situation to be in, because anytime I want to get more students or more faculty, it means somebody else has to lose. Yeah, so I'm delighted. I think the program has done extremely well. I'm proud of my faculty, my staff, my students. They're brilliant. You know, it's a great community. It's been a hard decade just being a small startup within a very big bureaucratic institution. But, you know, we're doing well. Come and visit.
I want to take one more question. Yes.
Hi, thanks. Jeff Thomas from New Orleans. We had a very good conversation just earlier about how to cultivate venture capital to enable entrepreneurship. To your point earlier about this larger system and the public good that also is a needed factor, how do you engineer that relationship between local government and the public interest community to provide those other facets to the ecosystem? Having spent time in both those sectors, I see a disconnect even to this day between what they do for a living and what these kind of innovation ecosystems need from them. And whereas in Silicon Valley you had good government that was incidental to what they were doing and they could benefit from it, you very much have to create that in a lot of places now, and you have to be very proactive with government. And if you want to create that diversity, you need to engage a civil society that isn't necessarily thinking like entrepreneurs. So I welcome your thoughts on how to create those relationships.
So you mean the relationships between the local venture capital and industrial community and the public sector?
Just advising government how it can be making decisions and investments to enable these kind of ecosystems, and then similarly, how do you engage the public interest community to incorporate into their mission statements this broader concept?
Right. I mean, the easy answer is these groups, you need to start conversations between these groups, and there needs to be, over time, some recognition of the common interest. You know, one of the problems that we have here in the Bay Area, and I think in a lot of parts of the US, is that governments are at the wrong scale. It's not just the data that's at the wrong scale, but there are 16 different city governments in Silicon Valley, and they compete as well as collaborate. So they compete for industry. They don't want to let housing in. So nobody wants housing in their backyards. So
because of the tax structure of California,
yeah, right.
They can't tax houses. They tax retail.
Property, right, Valley industry. So I think that, I'm not sure that Silicon Valley has the answer on this sort of public-private and intersectoral things. I wish I could sort of give you a quick answer to your question, but I think that this is the hardest thing because we don't have strong sense of the public good. There's not a sense here. There are a lot of good efforts. I should say that. There's sort of the civil society organizations that are very interesting and important. there are investors, and there are very, sort of civically minded entrepreneurs as well. And the public sector, as well. I mean, so there are pieces. It has not coalesced into an understanding of how to really work the public-private boundary, which I think is the next boundary, and it's really the important one. We talk a lot about public-private partnerships everywhere, but I don't know that we do them that well. It's like we don't do multidisciplinary very well, too. It means really turning yourself inside out. It means really giving up. So for the public sector, it means giving up your autonomy, giving up your resources, your status, and for the companies, likewise, giving up your sense that you did it on your own. So these are things that we are going to have to all work on collectively for, I think, certainly for the rest of my lifetime, before we can really, say that we've mastered it.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Saxenian.